The words one-party state are bandied about far too often in Scottish politics, but if you want to know what a real Scottish one-party state looks like, you need look no further than this building here. Glasgow City Chambers, the headquarters of Glasgow City Council, which has been continuously under the iron grip of the Labour Party since the elections of 1980, 37 years ago. In fact, since the Second World War, there have only been a few short spells when Labour haven't controlled this city. And yet we've known for at least the last 2 years that everything is about to change utterly.
Yes, 194,000.
The recent period in Glasgow politics has been like the last stand of Byzantium in 1453. The Ottomans are at the gates of Constantinople and no power on earth can stop them. At the local elections on the 4th of May, this council will fall. Labour will finally lose overall control, perhaps forever. But just how badly will they do? There has been some talk that Labour strategists believe they may hold on to more councillors in Glasgow and across Scotland than is widely believed, simply because of the quirks of the voting system. As supporters of independence, that's what we have to be wary of. The voting system we'll be using on the 4th of May is completely different from the additional member system we used to elect the Scottish Parliament 1 year ago. It's completely different from the first-past-the-post system we used to elect the Westminster Parliament 2 years ago. And it's completely different from the pure list system we used to elect the Scottish members of the European Parliament 3 years ago. Our local councillors will be elected in May by the Single Transferable Vote, or STV, which is a preferential system in which voters use numbers to rank the candidates in order of preference. That's an alien way of doing things for most of us.
North of the border, the Scottish Nationalists emerged as the largest party, although they didn't manage to win the victory they wanted in Glasgow after Labour managed to return to power.
We've only used this system in Scotland twice before, and we haven't really got used to how it works yet. So we desperately need to get our heads around the system in time for polling day and use it in a smart way to clear out as much of the Labour deadwood as possible and to contain any Conservative surge. Theresa May has called on Scottish voters to use the local elections to send a message about an independence referendum. Well, let's make sure we send the right message. Let's make sure our message is, actually, Theresa, we want that referendum.
Scottish council elections are happening on your doorstep. There's something you need to know about voting on Thursday the 4th of May.
So what's the correct way of using the STV voting system and what is the wrong way? If you read the information leaflet sent out by the Electoral Commission, the first thing that will leap out to you is that you don't actually need to rank all of the candidates if you don't want to.
You can rank as many or as few candidates as you like.
And because this is such an unfamiliar system, a lot of people are happy enough to have any excuse to retreat to their comfort zone. They think to themselves, I'd better just vote for one candidate or for one party, because they reckon using their lower preferences will somehow dilute their votes. They probably intuitively believe that STV must be a bit like the voting system used in the Eurovision Song Contest, where each jury awards 12 points to its favourite song, 10 points to its second favourite, all the way down to 1 point to its 10th favourite. Under the Eurovision system, there is a danger of each jury's lower preferences diluting the impact of its higher preferences. Suppose, for example, Sweden are leading the contest and Switzerland are in second place, 6 points behind. Then suppose the next jury gives the maximum 12 points to Switzerland, which on its own would be enough to push Switzerland into the lead. But the same jury also thinks the Swedish song is the fourth best, which means Sweden are awarded 7 points. That dilutes the impact of the top marks for Switzerland and keeps Sweden in the lead, just. People wrongly think the same thing can happen under STV in the local elections. That, for example, if they give an SNP candidate their first preference and give a Liberal Democrat their 11th preference, that 11th preference could backfire and prevent the SNP candidate from being elected. It's really important to stress that it doesn't work like that at all. The STV voting system is nothing like the Eurovision. It's not a point system. And your lower preferences cannot dilute your first preference in any way at all. The clue is in the name of the system: single transferable vote. Single vote. No matter how many preferences you use, in the first instance you're just casting one vote for one candidate, and that's your first preference vote. For as long as that candidate needs your vote will not budge from that candidate's column, and your lower preferences will not even be taken into account.
What do you want to say to everyone who's voted out there?
To illustrate how that works, I'm going to hop on a subway train and head off to Hill Head, which witnessed one of the closest fought battles in Glasgow at the last local elections. In 2012, the Hill Head ward saw 13 candidates battle it out for the 4 available seats. There were 2 Labour candidates, 2 SNP, 1 Green, 1 Tory, 1 Lib Dem, 1 Independent and several fringe party candidates. In the end, both Labour candidates were elected, along with the Green, but only one of the 2 SNP candidates was successful. For the last of the 4 seats, it was a very close run thing between Labour and the SNP, but after no fewer than 12 counts, Labour prevailed by just 53 votes. Now, in this scenario, let's imagine that you gave your first preference vote to the unsuccessful SNP candidate Mark Smith. Let's also imagine that you ranked every single one of the other 12 candidates in order of preference. You might wonder, what happened to those lower preferences as the 12 counts unfolded? Did they contribute in some way to Mr. Smith's defeat? The simple answer is that absolutely nothing happened to those lower preferences. They were completely ignored. On every one of the 12 counts, you just cast one vote for one candidate, Mark Smith. And the reason for that is that Mark Smith remained in contention on every count, and therefore was entitled to hold on to all the votes he had to begin with. But it was a very different story for voters who gave their first preferences to candidates who were elected or eliminated early on. Their votes went on a rather more exotic journey. In an STV election where there are 4 seats to be filled, any candidate needs to reach a quota of just over 20% of the total votes cast to be elected. The first stage of the process is that all of the first preference votes are counted. In Hill Head in 2012, just one candidate reached the quota on the first count. That was the other SNP candidate, Ken Andrew. In fact, he exceeded the quota by almost 300 votes. And under STV, those 300 votes were regarded as surplus votes that he no longer needed. So in the second count, they were redistributed to other candidates. As you'd expect, most of Mr. Andrew's voters gave their second preferences to Mark Smith, meaning that on the second count, Mr. Smith had a big jump from 488 votes to 676. But Mr. Smith didn't reach the quota on the second count, and nobody else did either. So to break the deadlock, the least popular candidates were eliminated one by one, and their votes were redistributed according to the lower preferences of their voters. As you can see, the vote tallies of all the top candidates gradually crept up and up as this process unfolded. Eventually, the Green candidate reached the quota on the 8th count, and one of the Labour candidates reached the quota on the 11th count, leaving a straight fight for the final seat between the second Labour candidate and Mark Smith. Mr. Smith didn't quite make it, but your vote helped him as much as it possibly could have done, and not one of your lower preferences counted against him in any way. In fact, the complete opposite happened. As the counts progressed, your vote for Mr. Smith was added to by votes transferred from the candidates who had already been either elected or eliminated. And that's the beauty of STV. Your second, third, fourth preferences cannot and will not be taken into account at all until your first choice candidate has either been safely elected or been eliminated. Even if your vote does eventually transfer to your second preference candidate, your third, fourth, fifth preferences cannot and will not be taken into account until your second choice candidate has been either elected or eliminated. And so it goes on down the line. That's why using your lower preferences is essentially a risk-free thing to do. It cannot backfire in any way. But can using your lower preferences do any good? As we've seen in the Hill Head example, the only reason Mark Smith even came close to winning a second seat for the SNP is that he received the second preferences of most people who voted for the other SNP candidate. So at the very least, SNP supporters should be giving their second preference to another SNP candidate if there is one, and also their third preference to an SNP candidate if the party puts up 3 candidates in the ward. You'll receive an SNP leaflet through the door, which will tell you how many SNP candidates there are and the exact order you should rank them in. It's important you follow that advice because it will be part of a carefully thought through vote management strategy. In Hill Head in 2012, there was the Green candidate. As it turned out, she was elected without needing much help from SNP voters. But what if she had been the one to get into a dogfight with a Labour candidate for the final seat? Then she would have needed all the help she could get. If SNP voters hadn't given a ranking to the Green, they would effectively have been abstaining as far as that final seat was concerned, which could easily have helped Labour to win. So after ranking all of the SNP candidates, SNP supporters should give their next highest preferences to the Greens and to any other pro-independence parties and candidates who may be standing in the ward. In some wards, there will be independent candidates and candidates from non-unionist fringe parties. As long as they aren't fascist nutters, wouldn't you prefer them to win a seat if it's a straight choice between them and a unionist party? So after you've ranked all the pro-independence candidates in your ward, it makes sense to give your next highest preferences to the remaining non-unionist candidates. Once you've done that, the only candidates left you won't have ranked will be from the unionist parties. Surely you'll want to stop at that point? Well, not necessarily. Remember that every Tory councillor elected will be seen as a full-blown endorsement of Theresa May's stance on Scotland. You can help minimise the number of Tory councillors elected by ranking Lib Dem and Labour candidates ahead of the Tories. As long as you make sure that you've ranked every single pro-Indy or non-unionist candidate ahead of every single unionist candidate, there's no risk attached to using your lowest preferences on the Lib Dems and Labour. I know it feels like a very strange thing to do, but it can't do any harm and it may do a lot of good. So that's the pro-independence argument for using all of your preferences or most of them. That's certainly what I'll be doing. Let's make sure we turn out in our droves on the 4th of May and use the voting system wisely to deliver a devastating defeat for the unionist parties and to deprive Theresa May of any excuse for trying to block Scotland's referendum.